Welcome to Harshaneeyam. Can a work of art ever truly be washed clean of the hands that funded it? Is it possible to create a masterpiece in the shadow of a monster? Today we are exploring these haunting questions through the lens of the director, the latest novel by the brilliant German author Daniel Kehlmann. Set against the harrowing backdrop of the late 1930s and 1940s, the story follows the legendary film director G.W. Pabst as he returns to Nazi-occupied Austria. Pabst finds himself ensnared by the propaganda machine of Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of Enlightenment and propaganda, who wielded absolute control over the German press and arts to serve the regime's twisted ideology. Pabst believes his collective genius can transcend such a system, but at what cost? Upon its original release in Germany under the title Lichtspiel, the novel became an immediate sensation, sparking intense literary debates about the moral compromises of artists during the Third Reich. This buzz has only grown as the book enters the global stage, with the English edition published in the year 2025. Now, having been shortlisted for the International Booker Prize 2026, the novel stands as one of the most anticipated and discussed works of contemporary fiction. Joining me today is the man who brought this intricate tonal masterpiece into English, the award-winning translator Ross Benjamin. We discuss the moral acrobatics of the artist and the tonal agility required to translate one of the most important voices in contemporary German literature. This is a conversation about light, shadow, and the high cost of staying silent. We believe that every great book is an invitation to a new world. Harshaneeyam serves as your gateway to these contemporary global masterpieces, connecting you with the translators and authors who shape our literary landscape. If you enjoy Harshaneeyam podcast, please follow the show on Apple, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform and leave a review for us. It will truly help us. And don't forget to share our podcast link with your other friends who enjoy similar content. To help us provide even more value, head over to our website www.harshaneeyam.com to complete our brief listener survey. Your feedback is the secret ingredient that helps us continuously improve. The link for the listener survey is included in the show notes too. So, welcome to Harshaneeyam podcast once again, Ross.
Thanks for having me back. It's good to be back.
You have translated Daniel Kehlmann before.
Yes.
What is it about his writing style that you find most interesting and really unique?
Yeah, I suppose there's a few different elements of it. Maybe as a translator, the richest is the versatility of it, just his tonal range and agility, that he's able to shift registers, from chapter to chapter, sometimes from sentence to sentence, in a way that's very thrilling, both as a reader and as a translator. As a reader, an admirer of his work, it's he has a really extraordinary gift for writing intellectually serious novels that have vivid and propulsive storytelling and a great deal of humor, even as he explores very dark themes and historical moments that are often very freighted with moral issues, and as we'll get into, and often very deeply researched, and yet he presents all of it both with a really light touch and avoids over explanation, and it can be very funny, sly, and inventive, even in this sort of material that can that's very serious and challenging.
He writes mostly historical fiction, is it? The Till is also historical fiction. There are magical elements and all that. So, one of the regular themes in Daniel Kehlmann, can I say it's exploring historical fiction?
It has been, yeah. It's been an ongoing interest of his, I think, but it's not exclusive. He's written novels that take place in contemporary times as well. The last two big novels have been historical, Till and The Director, and one of his breakthrough novel that really propelled him to much wider attention, although it was not his first novel, but it was his sort of big breakthrough novel, was Measuring the World, which was also a historical novel about Alexander von Humboldt and Carl Friedrich Gauss. And so I think he's rather famous for his historical novels. It's a mode that he has great virtuosity in. And it seems like maybe just, I'm speaking as a reader now, not as somebody with any special insight, but from his last two novels, it seems like something he's embraced even more recently. Um, Whereas before, Measuring the World was kind of his most striking historical fiction alongside other works of fiction that were not historical. Now it's joined by these more recent novels that are as far-reaching, and actually, I think both in many ways more far-reaching even than Measuring the World.
Yeah, coming to the novel, The Director, would you please introduce the novel to our listeners who have not yet read the novel?
Yeah, well, it's as you said, it's a historical novel, and it's about the real life historical figure, the Austrian filmmaker G.W. Pabst, who was a pioneer of cinema. A lot of what we call continuity editing, still modern film techniques were developed by him in his early works. He was known already in the 30s for Pandora's Box and the Three Penny Opera. He launched the careers of people like Louise Brooks and Garbo. And the novel follows the trajectory of his life, while also reimagining it and taking liberties to tell a fictional story. It begins with him in 1930s Hollywood, where he's frustrated by the loss of artistic control in the studio system, and ends up through the losing control over his film. The film he makes in Hollywood ends up being a flop, and he ends up going back to Europe. In the 30s, he had left because of Hitler. He was known as a leftist filmmaker. Three Penny Opera is a Brecht drama that he made the film of. So he was even known as the Red Pabst, which is a play on his name sounds like the German word for Pope, so it would be like the Red Pope. So he was thought of as a leftist. He left at the same time as many of the emigre directors who came to Hollywood, Fritz Lang, Billy Wilder, and but after he made a flop, or because he made a flop, he found his way back to Europe, and then eventually back to Austria at the worst possible time, when everyone was trying to flee in 1939 to visit his ailing mother. So far, this is staying pretty close to the historical facts, and this is also the story told in the novel. And that leaves him stranded in Nazi annexed territory just as the war begins and the borders close. So any intention he had of dealing with his mother's situation and arrangements, and then leaving, now is moot, and he's stuck. And then, he ends up making films for the nationalized German film industry under the Ministry of Propaganda, and that again is true to the historical record. And the novel traces through a series of episodes how someone who doesn't think of himself as a Nazi, who in fact fled the Nazis initially, becomes entangled in the regime and ends up making films under it. And so it chronicles how that complicity happens at a very granular level, and not only in Pabst, but in his family members and in other people around him, and even some minor characters. It is able to anatomize the very small steps that add up over time to the slippery slope of accommodation to an authoritarian regime.
He has an excuse that he wants to create a masterpiece. The way he executes it, it again goes back to prejudice. It again goes back to oppressing people and all that. That's very interesting.
That's right. And he crosses more and more boundaries as he becomes more desperate to make this final film. And the irony, that's not a spoiler, because from the beginning of the novel, and we know historically this film was lost. The last film he was working on under the Nazis. He made films after the war in real life, and in the novel actually. But was a shadow of his former fame, having been dishonored by his cooperation with the Nazi regime. The irony of his desperation to make this masterpiece and his willingness to become even more entangled in the horrors of the regime, and still more in the novel than anything that's known historically about him, more pointedly in the novel at least. But very much you can apply the same moral lens to the real Pabst. The fact that this movie was lost, and regardless of whether it was a masterpiece or not, the entire justification is moot from the beginning. That's an irony that's very like present to the reader throughout all of these justifications that might have, I don't know, if we knew that there was this great masterpiece at the end of the story or at the end of Pabst's career, it might complicate differently the claims that he's making for art, even though the structure is exactly the same. So I think that's another very thought-provoking aspect of the novel, that from his point of view, he might be making something worthy of the ages, that would somehow be worth the compromises that he's making, while we know otherwise.
So when it comes to historical fiction, and that too in the recent, it's not so distant past. Most of the records are available, publicly available, in the incident that has happened and many characters. What kind of a preparation was needed for you to translate this book into English?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't preparation like something I did before, but during the process of translation, I did a certain sort of research. It's not the kind of extensive historical and film research that Kelman had to do to write the novel, right? To just learn about film equipment. And I was just reading an interview with him where he talked about, he had to, there wasn't even sometimes good actual documentation of how the technology was used on film sets, and he had to actually talk to people who were still alive who had used these types of cameras and so on to really get a sense of, and that's one of the ways, his novels are deceptively, not full of historical explanation and factual explanation, and he might learn all about how to use these cameras, but he doesn't then feel obliged to put in a long passage explaining how the cameras were used. That would never really be there if you were living in that moment and it's the present. You just don't think about all of that. Like, he has a great discipline for letting little details emerge where they seamlessly belong in the immediacy of the story, that give that historical texture to it, while not kind of flaunting his research for its own sake and taking away from the movement of the story, or implausibly giving exposition that is not, doesn't really belong in a story that's like, for all the characters, is the present time. So I think he's actually brilliant at that, and a lot of novelists and historical novelists will, at least sometimes for a few pages, kind of make this error, and they want to show their research, even when it's not really in the service of the story. But for me, it wasn't that sort of research, but it was really more linguistic. It was about the film vocabulary, the social atmosphere, the historical texture, how people would talk. Certainly, the terms for the technical cinematic terms and the ones that would be appropriate to the time period. Yeah, most of which was a matter of internet research and consulting with the author, and sometimes with people who knew the technical language here and there for this or that term, just to make sure that it both made sense today and wasn't an anachronism. Yeah.
And what was the hardest part in translation for you?
I think it was both the hardest and the most rewarding part is probably that tonal slipperiness, the combination of the serious and the funny, the surreal and the historically grounded. The novel will slip into really hallucinatory passages that almost seem supernatural, or surreal at least, or as if the characters may be becoming unhinged from reality in a moment of panic or of intense sort of dissociation or whatever.
Even the dialogue, for that matter.
Yeah, and the dialogue is really historically charged. Sometimes it has to be both casual and horrifying. Other times it has to show the pressure the characters are under, that they have to really watch what they say. So there's a chapter I really love, and that I think really goes to the heart of this, where Pabst's wife is attending a book club with all wives of the powers that be, of men in the regime. And everybody is watching themselves because they feel surveilled by each other, and they know that saying the wrong word or referring to the wrong author who's now on the outs with the regime that kind of a slip could be really dangerous. But they're also having this sort of ordinary gossipy book club meeting where the danger keeps kind of peering through from under the surface. And so I had to pay a lot of attention to that, how to reproduce those hesitations and ellipses, the abrupt kind of self-censorship, while maintaining that sort of placid, ordinary surface of speech. That's something Kelman does expertly in the original, and to do it in a natural sounding English dialogue meant recreating that, and letting the pressure inside the prose come out by implication or register with the reader. Yeah.
Yeah, it has come out beautifully in your translation.
Thank you.
Now, in your opinion, what is the biggest takeaway from this novel for a reader?
I think one of the virtues of the novel is that it doesn't have a sort of tidy moral summation.
Yeah.
It's morally devastating to Pabst. Like, it's clear that he does not come out unstained by his encounter with power, and that he's definitely failed morally to either avoid or not become entangled with one of the very worst regimes in history. So that's the only thing that's sort of abundantly clear, but it's not sort of tidily summed up. It's not that you can exactly pinpoint, the one moment he went wrong and the one thing that you have to do differently. It's like always too late in the novel in a way, which that's maybe one very disconcerting takeaway from the novel, is that, like, by the time you turn around and it's too late, that you can't wait until it's too late to make your moral choice not to be complicit. As soon as you're sort of a little bit of the way in, you give them your little finger, they take the whole hand, kind of thing.
I felt to shelter himself away from the horror.
Mm-hmm.
He says he wants to produce a masterpiece, and he takes the shelter of an art form.
Yeah.
But that won't help.
Right. Yeah. It's the idea that somehow you can have an insular,
yes,
safe space within a totalitarian world, which is, an oxymoron. Yeah.
It's a very relevant for contemporary times.
I think that's part of its appeal right now, is that a lot of people are wrestling with the same questions.
Yes.
And it's clear that, like, Pabst is not an example of how to do it right. But at the same time, when you witness from inside his struggle, you see how you relate to a lot of things that make it very hard to make the right decisions, and all the more important to pay attention and to not insulate yourself in the way he does, not to look away the way he does, right? At very crucial moments in the novel, he sees something that does horrify him. It rightly horrifies him, and he finds a way to kind of rationalize it away, or to say there's nothing he can do, it's happening anyway, or somebody else tells him that, and he lets himself be cajoled and coaxed, and
Now, to conclude, would you please read a page or two from the novel in English?
Sure. Yeah, I was thinking of a page that captures the kind of I think it's a passage that shows where the comedy and the horror are inextricable, that they really go together. It's not sort of nightmare stuff and then you get comic relief, but that the comedy makes it even more unsettling when you're living this nightmare. The absurdity makes it even more nightmarish. Yeah. This excerpt takes place at Pabst's residence, where he's meeting with his screenwriter and his lead actor for his film, and his son and his son's friends from boarding school, or his son's classmates from boarding school, are there as a car approaches outside. Outside, a car approaches, gravel crunching under the brakes. A few seconds later, the doorbell rings. "Are we expecting anyone else?" asks Papa. Yerzebek enters with two men in leather coats. "Herr Pabst?" asks one. "G.W. Pabst?" asks the other. Jakob sees that Papa has turned chalk white. "Lost your voice?" asks the first. "I am Wilhelm Pabst," says Papa. What's Garbo like? Compliant? I'd sure like to meet her, says the other man. But excuse me, says the first. Completely forgot my manners. Kar Zunka. Aye, says the other, and Basler. Papa takes off his glasses, clears his throat, puts them back on. What can I do for you? Take it easy, Pabst, says Basler. Don't panic. Hey, Karzunka exclaims, pointing at Kraus. You're Jannings. Man, Emil Jannings, what a thing. Huge admirer. I'm Werner Kraus, Kraus says softly. Ah, well, not your fault, says Karzunka. Both laugh. Jakob watches them intently. He wants to remember them so that he can draw them. They're both so lean and tall and healthy, and their faces are so blank, as if nothing at all were looking out of their eyes. He feels furtive envy, to be free of thoughts while healthy and very strong. How wonderful that must feel. But seriously, says Karzunka, enough of the funny business. Yes, seriously, says Basler. Which of the gentlemen here is... He falls silent and looks at his colleague. The other pulls a notepad out of his pocket, taps his finger on the tip of his tongue, and squints as he flips through the pages once, twice, 3 times. Just kidding, says Karzunka. Keeping it light, says Basler. Keeping it carefree. Kurt Heuser, says Karzunka. Which of you is that? Please no multiple responses. Lottery win for Kurt Heuser, says Basler. Jakob sees Papa breathe a sigh of relief. Tension also falls away from Kraus, and Wilczek's hunched shoulders sink back down. But the screenwriter's face has become very narrow. He sucks in his cheeks, his eyes wide open. Me, says Heuser. Are you sure? Asks Karzunka. You're him without a doubt? What's this about? Heuser asks. Everyone asks that, says Karzunka. Always, says Basler. Always, 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 says Karzunka. And yet we never answer that. We just say, come with us. If you have nothing to hide, you don't need to be afraid. It can be quite harmless. That happens too. Not usually, though. No, not usually. Shall we go? Now, asks Heuser. They both laugh. Everyone always asks that too, says Basler. Well, if it's not a convenient time, we could come back next year. They laugh again. Now Boris and Felix are smiling too. Then the cameraman smiles, and finally Werner Kraus smiles too. So yes, says Karzunka, right now, immediately, and move quickly or else we'll have to shift modes. Change keys, says Basler, from major to minor. This man is from the ministry, Heuser points at Kuno Kramer. You have to talk to him first. Oh really, asks Karzunka. They both look at Kramer. He sits motionless, staring at the tabletop. Which ministry? Kramer clears his throat, then says softly, propaganda. Oh, says Karzunka. And you want to say something? No, says Kramer without looking up. No. Are you sure? We could put that in our report. We're making a report? Asked Basler. There's always a first time. Thought so. Oh, not necessary, says Kramer. Everything's fine. Thought so, says Karzunka. Heuser, says Basler. Shall we?